It starts with the rain, not a cleansing spring shower that washes the world clean, but a cold, relentless, inescapable drizzle that seems to have forgotten how to stop. It has been raining for weeks, maybe months now. You can't remember the last time you felt truly dry. There's a permanent dampness that has seeped into your bones, into the very mortar of your world. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Lore. Tonight, we're not visiting a king's court or a grand battlefield. We're stepping into the mud and the quiet, creeping dread of the early 14th century to witness an apocalypse that arrived not with fire, but with water. This is the story of the Great Famine of 1315. This isn't a history lesson of dates and figures. This is an immersion into a world where the sky itself broke its promise, where the most fundamental rhythm of life, sow, grow, reap, simply stopped. You will feel the chill, you will hear the rain, and you will understand the quiet terror of an empty grain sack. If you find these atmospheric journeys into the past a fitting companion for the quiet hours, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It lets me know you're out there listening in the dark. Before the rain came, life was normal, predictable at least. You live in a small village, somewhere in Northern Europe. The world is as it has always been. You are governed by the seasons and the church bells. The years leading up to 1315 had been relatively good ones. The population had grown, new land had been cleared for farming. There was a sense, perhaps, that humanity had found a stable rhythm with the earth. You knew hardship, of course. Winter was always cold, lords were always demanding, and life was never easy. But you understood the rules. You planted seeds in the spring. You weeded in the summer. You harvested in the autumn. And you survived the winter on what you had stored. The sun would rise. The seasons would turn. It was the only truth that felt solid. Then in the spring of 1315, that truth began to dissolve. The rain began, and it did not end. It wasn't a series of storms. It was a permanent state of being, a grey sheet of water hanging between heaven and earth, day after day, week after week. At first it's an annoyance. The fields are too wet to plough properly. The mud becomes a permanent feature of your life, a third shoe you never asked for. You tell yourself, it's just a wet spring, it will pass. Hope is a stubborn weed, but it doesn't pass. The rain continues into May, then June. The seeds you manage to sow are washed away, or they simply rot in the cold, waterlogged soil. The few green shoots that appear are pale and weak. The village starts to murmur. The older folk shake their heads, saying they've never seen a year like it. The priest calls for more prayers, but the sky doesn't seem to be listening. By midsummer, when the fields should be alive with tall, healthy crops, they are instead barren seas of mud and shallow pools of standing water. The vibrant green of a normal summer is replaced by a monotonous, sickly brown. It's not the silence of the land that scares you, it's the sound, the endless, drumming, indifferent sound of the rain. The quiet anxiety that had been a low hum in the village begins to sharpen into real fear. You walk past your small storage shed where the grain from last year's good harvest is kept. You've never had to think too hard about it before. It was just there. But now you find yourself stopping. You look at the sacks, and for the very first time in your life, you begin to count them. You begin to calculate, and as you stand there listening to the relentless rain on the roof, a new cold feeling begins to seep in, a chill that has nothing to do with the damp air. It's the dawning realization that the harvest isn't just late, it's not coming, and you have no idea what you will do when the last sack is empty. The counting of the grain sacks in your small damp shed becomes a quiet, obsessive ritual. But the quiet mathematics of survival, as you're learning, offers no comfort, only a clearer picture of the abyss. The relentless rain of summer finally slackens into a sullen grey autumn, but it brings no relief. There is no harvest. The fields, which should be bustling with the communal energy of reaping, are instead monuments of silent, muddy failure. The crops you planted with hope in the spring are now a black, decomposing slime in the soil. The legumes, the peas and beans that were supposed to be a fallback have also failed, their pods empty or moulded. The air, which should be filled with the hearty, dusty smell of harvested grain, instead carries a faint, sour scent of decay. You stand at the edge of your worthless field, and for the first time, you understand what true emptiness feels like. The first truly terrible decision arrives quietly in the privacy of your own hut. It's the decision about the seed grain. The small portion of last year's harvest that you so carefully set aside, the grain meant for planting next spring, now sits there, a tiny cache of potential life. It represents every hope you have for the future. And now you have to decide, do you eat your future to survive the present? Every grain you eat is a plant that will never grow, a loaf of bread that will never be baked next year. It's a silent, desperate gamble, a bargain made with a future you're no longer sure you'll live to see. Then the animals begin to suffer. The common pastures are waterlogged and barren, offering little nourishment. The hay from the summer, what little could be saved from the wet, is sparse and of poor quality. Your cow, if you're lucky enough to have one, grows thinner, her ribs becoming more prominent each day. Her milk, once a vital source of fat and protein for your children, lessens to a trickle, then stops. Out of desperation, many villagers begin to slaughter their livestock, their oxen needed for ploughing, their pigs, their sheep. For a week or two there might be a strange, brief abundance of meat in the village, sold for whatever price one could get. But then it's gone. And with the draft animals gone, the prospect of ploughing the fields next year, even if the rains stop, becomes a distant dream. The silence of the fields is soon joined by the silence of the barns. The little grain that is available for purchase, held by merchants or lords with larger reserves, becomes impossibly expensive. The price of wheat, rye and barley skyrockets, doubling, then tripling, then climbing even higher. Congratulations! The contents of your small coin pouch, once enough to buy a piglet, can now barely afford you a single loaf of bad bread. The village market transforms from a place of commerce to a theatre of quiet desperation. People eye the merchants' dwindling sacks with a mixture of hunger and resentment. There are no friendly haggles, only the hard, cold calculus of who can pay and who will starve. As the first bite of winter arrives, the familiar cold is now accompanied by a new, more terrifying companion, a deep, pervasive and gnawing hunger. The mood in the village shifts. The quiet cooperation of harvest time curdles into suspicion. You look at your neighbours differently. You wonder what they have stored away. You watch their smoke, trying to guess if they are cooking something more substantial than you are. At night, a wooden bar on your door feels thinner. less secure than it did before. The greatest fear is no longer just the cold outside, but the desperation of the people living all around you. To survive, you begin to eat things that were never meant for human consumption. You forage in the sodden woods not for berries but for acorns and roots, which you must boil repeatedly to leach out their bitterness. You strip bark from trees, you dig up clay and mix it with the last of your bran to create a crude, gritty bread that fills the stomach but offers little nourishment. This is the taste of famine, the taste of dirt, of bark, of utter desperation. It's a flavour you will never, ever forget. The taste of bark and dirt becomes a familiar, unwelcome guest in your mouth. Hunger is no longer a temporary pang. It has become a permanent resident in your belly, a dull, constant ache that colours every waking moment and haunts your thin, troubled sleep. But the famine you're discovering does more than just hollow out your stomach. It begins to hollow out your world. The quiet bonds of community, woven together over generations of shared harvests and festivals, begin to fray. Before, a missing chicken was a minor annoyance. Now it's a potential riot. A locked door was for privacy. Now it's a desperate necessity. You start to recognise a new kind of look in your neighbour's eyes, not of friendship, but of calculation. They are counting your ribs, just as you are counting theirs. The unspoken question hangs in the damp, cold air. Who has more left? The physical toll is relentless and visible everywhere. People move more slowly, their steps heavy with a weakness that comes from empty stomachs. The sounds of the village change. The hearty laughter of men after a day's work is gone, replaced by a rasping cough that seems to echo from every hut. Children who should be full of energy are listless, their games forgotten. Their faces are pale, their eyes seem too large for their small, thin frames. You learn to measure wealth in a new way. A man is not rich because he has land, but because he still has a hint of colour in his cheeks, because his walk is still steady, because he does not stumble from dizziness when he stands. A simple cold, once a nuisance to be sweated out by the fire, is now a potential death sentence for a body that has no strength left to fight. And what of the powers that be? The church and the nobility? The parish priest tells you this is a test from God, a punishment for the sins of mankind. He organises solemn processions, leading the weakened villagers through the endless rain and mud, chanting prayers for deliverance. You march and you pray, your feet sinking into the cold muck, and you wonder if God can even hear you over the sound of your own stomach. The lords and knights, secure behind the thick stone walls of their castles, face their own version of the crisis. But it is a world apart from yours. They too may have less variety on their tables, their grand feasts now more subdued. But they are not starving. They have granaries, stores of salted meat, and armed guards to protect them. Sometimes a lord might distribute a small amount of grain to his most desperate tenants, an act that is part of charity, part a pragmatic effort to ensure his workforce doesn't completely vanish before the next planting season, if it ever comes. But it's never enough. You hear whispers that the Lord's hunting dogs are still eating better than your children, and you find you have no trouble believing it. As the first winter of the famine, 1315 to 1316, tightens its icy grip, a deeper, more psychological darkness descends. Hope begins to feel like a foolish luxury. The world seems to have turned upside down, its natural laws broken. The sun is a distant memory, the earth a barren soup of mud. Darker whispers begin to circulate in the huts at night, stories you try to push from your mind but cannot entirely ignore. Tales of travellers disappearing on lonely roads, of graves being disturbed, of the most unthinkable acts committed in the name of survival. You don't want to believe them, but when you look into the hollowed-out eyes of a starving stranger, a terrifying new question arises. What would you be capable of to see one more sunrise? The famine is no longer just a crisis of the body. It is now a crisis of the soul. The first winter, the winter of 1315, was a long, grinding lesson in just how much the human body can endure. You survived it, barely. But survival, you're learning, isn't a victory. It's just a postponement. As the days began to lengthen and a pale, watery light hinted at the arrival of spring in 1316, a fragile, dangerous thing began to sprout in the village, alongside the weeds. Hope. Perhaps this was it, people whispered. The end of the curse. God's anger had been appeased, and the rhythm of the world would return. What little seed grain had been saved through a winter of gnawing hunger was brought out, a treasure more precious than gold. You hold these seeds in your hand, a handful of next year's life, and you place them in the cold, wet earth, an act of blind, desperate faith. Then the world played its cruelest trick. The rain returned. Not the gentle showers of a normal spring, but the same cold, relentless, soul-crushing downpour as the year before. The ground, never having had a chance to dry, became a vast, impassable quagmire. The precious seed grain, the village's final gamble, rotted where it lay, and with that second failed planting, the hope that had sustained you through the winter finally shattered like thin ice. This was no longer a single bad year. This was the new reality. The world was broken, and you were trapped in it. The summer of 1316 marked the absolute peak of the famine's horror. With the previous year's stores completely exhausted and no new harvest on the horizon, society began to unravel at the seams. The fight for survival became intensely personal. The quiet mathematics of hunger simplifies all relationships. There are no longer neighbours. There are only other mouths. Doors were barred day and night. The thin wail of a hungry child became the village's unofficial anthem. You learn to see the world differently. Everything becomes a potential, if wretched, source of calories. You strip bark from elm trees and grind it into a coarse, bitter flour. You dig for roots you once considered inedible. You boil the leather from old shoes and belts until it becomes a gelatinous, barely swallowable paste. The few remaining domestic animals disappear, taken by hunger or stealth. The village dogs and cats vanish. The mice in the walls become a welcome source of protein. You stop thinking of yourself as a farmer, a Christian, a man. You are simply a vessel for a single, all-consuming desire: to eat. The physical toll was devastating. Weakened by chronic malnutrition, the population became incredibly vulnerable to disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and various fevers swept through villages and towns, meeting little resistance from emaciated bodies. The death rate soared. Even the nobility and the church were not entirely immune, though they did not starve. The kingdom itself grew weak. With no surplus crops, tax revenues collapsed. Law and order frayed as bands of desperate, starving people roamed the countryside. King Edward II of England, it was reported, had trouble finding bread for his own court on a visit to St Albans. Imagine a world so broken that even a king cannot be assured of his daily bread. And still it rained. The sky became a permanent, oppressive ceiling of grey, a constant reminder of a world that felt abandoned by God. You no longer looked up hoping for sun. You simply stopped looking up at all. Your world became the mud beneath your feet and the gnawing emptiness inside you. Yet, as the year 1316 drew to its close, the pattern began to change, almost imperceptibly. The downpours became less frequent. There were days with only a light drizzle, and then, impossibly, a day with no rain at all. It was too late for a harvest. Another brutal winter was already closing in, a winter that would be faced with even fewer resources than the last. But it was something, a flicker of change. It was a hope you were almost afraid to feel, a hope as fragile and as pale as a winter sunbeam. You had survived the rain. Now you had to survive the hope that it might one day actually end. You survived the second winter. That's the fact of it. You are still breathing, a truth your body seems to question with every aching joint and every hollow pang of hunger. But survival, you've learned, isn't a finish line. It's just a starting point for a new kind of dread. As the year turns to 1317, the world outside your hut begins to change, and you watch it with the wariness of a cornered animal. The rain, your constant tormentor, finally relents. The endless drumming on the thatch roof softens to a drizzle, then fades into a damp, unnerving silence. The sun appears, not as a warm, welcome friend, but as a pale, watery eye in the sky, looking down on the devastation its absence helped create. You stand outside, your face to its pale light, and the feeling of warmth on your skin is so unfamiliar it almost hurts. The land begins to dry, but it does not heal. The fields, once fertile, are now expanses of cracked grey earth, scarred by the floods and leached of their life. The ground is hard, compacted, and stubborn. The tapestry of history you see isn't always woven with grand threads. Sometimes it's just mud and memory stuck together. The village stirs not with the energy of renewal, but with the slow, painful movements of the deeply exhausted. The impulse to plant is there. It's a muscle memory from a different lifetime, but the means are almost entirely gone. The seed grain, your last link to a normal future, is mostly gone, eaten during the darkest days of winter, just to stay alive. The few handfuls that remain are treated with a desperate, fearful reverence. The oxen that once pulled the plough have long since been slaughtered. So now, you must turn the earth yourselves. You are not planting a field. You are scratching at a grave, begging it to give you back some life. It's a pathetic effort. Small patches are broken up with immense, back-breaking labour. You watch your wife, her face thin as paper, carefully dropping single seeds into the shallow furrows, counting them as if they were jewels. There is a terrifying quietness to the work, a lack of the usual harvest songs or communal chatter. There is only the sound of laboured breathing and the dull thud of wood against unyielding earth. The village itself is a ghost of what it was. You walk past empty huts, their doorways gaping like open mouths in a silent scream. The families that lived there are gone, fled, or simply vanished into the silence of the past 2 winters. You know their names. You try not to say them. The silence in the village isn't peaceful. It's the sound of absence. You look at the faces of the survivors, and you see the famine has carved its story onto them. The children are small and quiet, their eyes old with things they should never have seen. The adults are gaunt, moving with a permanent, bone-deep weariness. You don't trust your neighbours completely, not anymore. You all survived, and the unspoken question of how hangs between you, a chilling, invisible fog. When the first shoots finally appear this time, tiny and green against the brown earth, there is no celebration. There is only a sharp, painful intake of breath. It is a fragile, terrifying sight. Every day becomes a new anxiety. You watch the sky for any sign of the returning rains. A single dark cloud can send a ripple of panic through the village. You guard the tiny sprouts against birds, against rabbits, against the creeping possibility of another failure. This is not recovery. This is survival on a razor's edge. The hunger is still there, a constant, dull ache. The meager harvest, if it comes, will not be enough for feasts or security. It will only be enough, maybe, to get through the next winter. The famine taught you a brutal lesson. Hope is not a feeling. It is a debt you take out against an uncertain future, and you pray you'll live long enough to pay it back. The first taste of bread made from a new harvest after years of eating dirt and desperation is a strange experience. It doesn't taste like salvation. It tastes like fear. The fear that it won't last. The fear that tomorrow the rain will return. You chew slowly, mechanically, and realize that a full belly after so long doesn't bring peace. It brings a new kind of terrible clarity. The world has been fundamentally broken, and even with food in your stomach, you can see the cracks everywhere. The old economy of coins and barter has been shattered. Money became worthless when there was nothing to buy. You learn a lesson that stays with you. Silver is a comforting fiction, but hunger is a brutal truth. Now a new economy emerges, one based on tangible, edible reality. Your neighbour, who managed to save a pig, is now a man of immense power. The blacksmith, whose skills were once essential, finds that no one can afford to have their tools mended. The value of everything has been stripped down to a single, brutal question. Can you eat it? You guard your small harvest with a paranoia you never knew you possessed. At night, you don't just bar the door. You lie awake, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the thatch. The scars of the famine are etched not just onto the landscape, but onto the bodies and minds of the survivors. You see it in the village. The children who lived through it are smaller, thinner than the generation before them. There's a persistent, hacking cough that never seems to leave the village, a legacy of weakened lungs and years of malnutrition. You survived, yes, but you carry the ghosts of the famine inside you. There's a deep-seated fear of the sky now. A dark cloud on the horizon can send a flicker of pure animal panic through you. You find yourself hoarding food in secret places. A small pot of grain buried beneath a loose floor stone. A string of dried onions hidden in the rafters. It's a secret, even from your own family. A secret you keep because the famine taught you that, in the end, your own survival is your own responsibility. The old structures of power, which once seemed as solid and eternal as the stone of the Lord's castle, now feel fragile, almost fraudulent. You look to your Lord, to your knight, to protect you. They couldn't command the clouds or stop the rain. They hoarded their own grain behind their high walls while you ate bark. The respect born of fear and tradition has been replaced by a quiet, simmering resentment. The Lord's authority, you realise, was built on the promise of a full harvest. An empty field makes a king, and a peasant equally powerless against the sky. You hear stories of peasants in other villages simply walking away from their ancestral lands, abandoning their feudal obligations to seek a new life elsewhere, as vagabonds or labourers in a distant town. The old bonds are broken. Even the authority of the church feels different. You prayed. The whole village prayed, marched in processions, offered up penance, and still the rain fell. While your faith in God might remain a private, personal thing, your faith in the institution, in the priests and bishops who seemed as helpless as everyone else, has been shaken. You see the world now not as a place of divine order, but as one of chaos, caprice, and a profound, terrifying indifference. And so, another season turns. There is food in your belly for now. The fields are planted again. But something has been permanently lost. Trust has been lost. The certainty that the world makes sense has been lost. The famine killed millions with hunger, but it wounded everyone else with memory. The memory of hunger is a cruel and patient teacher. It settles deep in your bones, a permanent chill that no summer sun can fully warm. And you come to realise that memory is not just a ghost of the past, it's a powerful and patient architect of the future. The Great Famine may have officially ended around 1317 as the weather patterns stabilised, but the world it left behind was a different place, scarred and fundamentally altered. You and your surviving neighbours don't just replant the fields as they were before. That blind faith in a single vast crop of wheat is gone, shattered. The famine taught you a brutal lesson in the danger of putting all your hope in one basket, or in this case, one type of grain. You now look at your small plot of land not as a simple field, but as a portfolio of risks that must be carefully managed. You might plant some hardier grains, like oats or barley, which can better withstand difficult conditions, even if they fetch a lower price. You dedicate more space to nitrogen-fixing legumes, like peas and beans. Having observed, without understanding the science, that they seem to revitalise tired soil, there's a quiet diversification, a move towards resilience over maximum yield. Some land that was once used for crops is now given over to pasture for livestock, if you can afford to acquire an animal again. The most profound change, however, is the silence left by the sheer number of the dead. Historians estimate that in some parts of Northern Europe, the famine and its accompanying diseases wiped out 10 to 25% of the population. In your village, you don't need statistics, you feel it every day. You walk down the muddy track and see the empty, decaying huts of families you once knew by name. The fields, even as they begin to recover, feel vast and empty because there are fewer hands to work them. For the first time in living memory, the most valuable commodity is not land, but labour. This creates a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the balance of power. The lords of the manor, whose wealth is meaningless without peasants to work their lands, can no longer be quite as demanding. You hear stories of lords offering better terms, lower rents, or more freedoms to entice tenants to stay or to attract new ones from abandoned villages. It's a strange and unsettling feeling to know that your own survival has suddenly made you more valuable. It's not freedom, not yet, but it's a crack in the old, unshakable feudal order. The psychological scars run deep. The easy faith in a divinely ordered, benevolent world has been profoundly damaged. For years you prayed, you fasted, you walked in solemn processions, and in return, the heavens gave you only more rain and more hunger. The old songs about valiant knights and their noble quests now sound a bit hollow in your ears. You find you're more interested in the quiet, cunning stories of survivors, of tricksters who outsmarted death, or a greedy merchant. A harder, more cynical pragmatism has taken root. The famine also left a physical mark on your generation. The children who survived years of severe malnutrition grew up to be, on average, shorter and less robust than their parents. You see it in the young men in the village. They lack the stature of their grandfathers. The famine didn't just steal the dead, it stole inches and ounces from the living, leaving a physical signature on their very bones. And so you carry on. You work the recovering land under a sky you will never fully trust again. You store every bit of surplus food with a hoarder's anxiety. You teach your children the importance of resilience, of not taking a full belly for granted. The great rains have stopped, and the grain slowly returns to the fields. But the world you knew before 1315 is gone forever, washed away in a flood of rain and hunger, replaced by something harder, warier, and irrevocably changed. You live in a world of ghosts, not the spectral kind that rattle chains, but the quieter, more pervasive kind. The ghosts of empty chairs, of fields that should be fuller, of children who will never grow older, but the ghosts of the Great Famine, you soon discover, do not simply vanish with the returning sun. They take on new, more insidious forms. The hunger that hollowed out your body has left the gates wide open for other horsemen of the apocalypse to ride in. With bodies across the land weakened by years of severe malnutrition, the population has become a dry field ready for the spark of disease. And the spark comes. Waves of sickness, what your descendants might call typhoid, influenza, dysentery, and other fevers, sweep through the recovering but profoundly vulnerable communities. You survived starvation only to be threatened by a fever. It feels like a cruel cosmic joke played by a bored god. The village priest who once led processions to pray for an end to the rain now spends his days presiding over funerals. The sound of a single tolling church bell becomes a grimly familiar punctuation to the week. Fear shifts from the emptiness in your stomach to the rasping cough of your neighbour, to the sudden, unexplained fever in your own child. The world which had been silent with hunger is now filled with the quiet, desperate sounds of sickness. The fraying of social bonds, which began with the hoarding of food, now accelerates. The famine shattered the old order, and in its wake, lawlessness grows. Bands of desperate, landless men, their homes and livelihoods lost, roam the countryside. They are called vagabonds, outlaws, or wolf-heads, men who live outside the law. Travel, once merely difficult, now becomes dangerous. Merchants hire armed guards. Villagers, like you, reinforce their doors and look upon every stranger with immediate, profound suspicion. You learn to read the landscape, not for signs of rain, but for signs of ambush. That quiet patch of woods, on the road to the next village, is no longer a source of firewood. It's a place of potential danger. In the desperate search for an explanation for all this suffering, the blame game begins. It's not enough to blame the weather. The scope of the disaster feels too personal, too malicious for that. It must be someone's fault. And so, the quiet poison of scapegoating begins to seep into the cracks of the broken community. Whispers turn against outsiders, against a neighbouring village accused of hoarding, or against those who manage to survive with their resources seemingly intact. Darker accusations of witchcraft or sorcery surface, that someone angered God, made a pact with dark forces to bring on the endless rain. It's an irrational response to an overwhelming tragedy, but it gives the fear a face, a target. You see this happening, and you learn another hard lesson. Hunger makes people not only desperate, but also cruel, and beneath it all, a new kind of anger takes root. It's a deep, slow-burning resentment against the nobility and the structures of power that failed so completely to protect the common people. You survived not because of your lord, but in spite of him. You endured while he remained secure behind his stone walls, with his well-fed soldiers. You keep your head down now, to bring in the harvest. But you remember who ate while you starved. And memory, you know better than anyone, has a very long fuse. The great hunger eventually subsided, but it left behind a world that was now hungry for something else entirely: change. The world after the Great Famine is a quieter place. It is the quiet of absence, the hush that falls over a landscape that has been scoured clean of a significant portion of its life. And change, you discover, is not always a loud revolution with banners and trumpets. Sometimes change is just the eerie silence of a neighbour's hut that will never be occupied again. The immediate, desperate struggle for a mouthful of food has passed, but you are now living in the long, strange, and unsettling shadow of the catastrophe. You start to notice the new geography of your world. There are footpaths leading to fields that no one walks anymore. Entire hamlets, small clusters of homes that once dotted the landscape a few miles from your own village, have simply vanished, swallowed by encroaching woods and weeds. Imagine yourself walking through the forest in search of firewood and stumbling upon the faint, moss-covered foundation stones of a house where a family once lived, laughed, and ultimately starved. These lost villages are everywhere, quiet monuments to the sheer scale of the death that swept across the land. The world feels larger, emptier, and more haunted than it ever did before. This demographic collapse, this great emptying, has a profound and unexpected consequence, that you begin to feel not as an emptiness, but as a strange new weight in your own hands. For generations the rule of the world was simple. Land was scarce and precious, while people were plentiful and cheap. Now that equation has been turned on its head. There is land, abandoned plots, fields left untended, but there are not enough healthy bodies to work it. For the first time in your life, perhaps for the first time in your family's memory, your labour has become valuable. This new reality changes the quiet, often tense, conversations you have with the Lord's reeve or steward. Before the famine, you would have approached him with your head bowed, a supplicant begging for leniency on your rent or taxes. Now there is a subtle shift. He needs you. He needs your hands to till the fields, to bring in a harvest, to generate the wealth upon which his master's castle stands. You are no longer just a pair of hands tied to a plot of land. You are now a resource, and you are scarce. You start to hear stories from other villages, tales of peasants demanding and receiving better terms, lower rents, an end to certain feudal duties. The decline of serfdom, a slow process over centuries, was given a sudden, brutal push by the famine. The chains, while not broken, have been perceptibly loosened. You see this change reflected in the landscape itself. The intensive focus on grain farming, which required so many hands for ploughing, sowing and harvesting, is no longer sustainable in many areas. Lords and surviving farmers begin to shift their strategies. The tapestry of history, you see, is not just woven by kings, but also by the quiet, pragmatic decisions of ordinary people trying to survive. Fields that once rippled with wheat are now enclosed with rough fences or stone walls and given over to sheep. Sheep require far fewer people to manage, and their wool has become an increasingly valuable commodity. The sight of large flocks grazing on the hillsides, a quiet and pastoral scene, is actually the visual evidence of a massive economic and social upheaval, a response to the trauma of the famine. For those who survived, there is a grim inheritance. You might find yourself with the opportunity to take over the abandoned holding of a neighbour who perished, combining it with your own small plot. You plough his field now, and sometimes, in the quiet of the morning, you think you can feel his ghost watching you, a silent guardian of the land that he loved and lost. For a small number of fortunate or merely resilient survivors, this consolidation of land can lead to a slight increase in prosperity in the decades that follow. It's a prosperity built on graves, a comfort haunted by the memory of those who had to disappear for you to have a little more space in the world. This is the new, unsettling arithmetic of your time. The world had to be nearly emptied for a single peasant to finally feel his own weight in it. The newfound value of your labour, the quiet shrinking of your village, the subtle shift in the balance of power between you and your lord. These are the slow tectonic changes reshaping your world. But the quiet mathematics of survival, you found, also leaves behind a debt of the soul. The physical hunger has receded, replaced by a different kind of emptiness. It is the hollow space left by the dead, and the persistent, nagging echo of fear. You now live in a world haunted by the memory of rain. A prolonged summer shower, once a simple inconvenience, now sends a jolt of primal anxiety through you. A grey, overcast week feels like a personal threat. You find yourself scanning the horizon for clouds with the same vigilance you once used to watch for wolves. Your relationship with the sky, with the very source of life-giving water, has been permanently poisoned by distrust. It is a quiet, internal trauma shared by every survivor. You see it in the eyes of your neighbours when they glance upwards, a quick, nervous flicker that betrays a shared memory of helplessness. This trauma manifests in strange new habits. Food is no longer just sustenance, it is security, an object of almost religious reverence. You watch your family eat, and a part of you feels a quiet panic if they consume their portion too quickly. Wasting a single crumb feels like a moral failing, a sacrilege against the memory of those who starved. You now understand hoarding not as greed, but as a form of prayer, a prayer against the return of the emptiness. You keep your own small secret caches of grain or dried beans, hidden away not just from neighbours, but from the uncertainty of the world itself. The old structures of power, which once seemed as solid and eternal as the stone of the Lord's castle, now feel fragile, almost fraudulent. You look to your lord, to your knight, to protect you. They couldn't. They couldn't command the clouds or stop the rain. Their authority, you realise, was built on the promise of a full harvest. An empty field makes a king and a peasant equally powerless against the sky. This quiet erosion of deference has consequences. You hear more murmuring in the village tavern, less talk of piety and duty, more talk of unfair rents and the rights of those who work the soil. The seeds of peasant revolts that will shake kingdoms later in the century are not sown in times of plenty by political theorists. They are sown right now, in the minds of survivors like you. Historians in later centuries will give this period a name, the beginning of the Little Ice Age. They will speak of climatic shifts, of volcanic activity in distant lands affecting weather patterns, of solar minimums. But for you, it has no name. It is simply the world turning colder, less predictable, less forgiving. The Great Famine, you begin to suspect, was not a singular, freak event. It was a brutal initiation into a new, harsher reality. The good old days your grandfather spoke of now seem like a dream of a different planet, a time of impossible warmth and stability. You were not spared from the famine. You were simply left behind to remember it. You stand on the scarred earth, under a sky you will never fully trust again, carrying the ghosts of those who were lost and the heavy knowledge of what it takes to live through a world undone. The memory of hunger has become part of the soil, part of your bloodline, a quiet, foundational story for the new, harder era that has now begun. But the land remembers, and so do you. Let the silence of the fields now be your peace. Rest now,